everyone. In this lecture, I want to talk about Mark and the Messianic secret. The Messianic secret is one of these themes in the Gospel of Mark that is really peculiar. And I want to kind of highlight sort of its features and provide a bit of an explanation for why Mark might be doing this. Remember, as we talked about the fourfold gospel, we want to attend to what Mark uniquely is doing and try to understand his purposes in producing this story about Jesus. I want to situate it a little bit in some of its social, historical, cultural, political context before we begin and before we start with that theme of the Messianic secret. So Mark is written during the reign of the Roman Empire, right? Of course, if you think about the history of the Jewish people, it's one story of oppression after another from the time of the exile, right? Different foreign oppressors. And at the time of the Roman Empire, this is continued. There was a period of independence, the Hasmonean dynasty, after the Maccabean revolt, but we are once again in a situation in which Israel is under the thumb of somebody else, right? And this longing for messianic sort of uprising is fermenting even more during this time. Mark was probably written during the reign of one or two particular Caesars, either during the time of Nero. Nero ruled from 54 to 68. He was the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, or at the very beginning of the reign of Vespasian, who started in 69. Depending on when you date the Gospel of Mark, it's probably going to be written sometime during one of their two reigns. And if you know anything about Nero and you know anything about Vespasian in terms of some of their peculiarities, and in regard to Nero, some of the persecuting that he was known for, this might influence some of the background of the Gospel of Mark. And Vespasian, of course, was emperor when Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70 by Titus. So that's some potential context that could influence a lot of how we understand what Mark refers to at various points, especially in the Olivet Discourse, which we could say more about. But in terms of what was going on in Jerusalem specifically in relation to this kind of political situation, we need to talk about sects and the city, the various Jewish sects of Jerusalem. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and the Essenes. How did they all respond to their political oppressors? Well, generally speaking, the Pharisees, for example, were quite skeptical of Roman power. They had closer ties to the average person. The Sadducees sort of embraced the political situation, the status quo. They were not really known for holding to a lot of sort of supernatural beliefs. They didn't believe in angels and demons and the resurrection, for example, as far as we can tell from the New Testament, given some of their line of questioning towards Jesus. We don't have much else to go off of outside of what we actually do have in the New Testament, though. They also seem to have only held on to the Torah as the sort of sacred scriptures that they embraced. And so their sort of theology doesn't include a lot of the later prophetic texts. But in terms of the political situation, they embraced it. They were much more in line with the status quo. Zealots rebelled against this political situation. Technically, there weren't zealots, capital Z zealots, until the revolt against Rome during the Jewish War from 66 and on, and then culminating in that destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. But there were certainly people who would, later display the kind of rebellion that we do see that the zealots are a part of. So that appellation is sometimes looking back upon people who shared sympathies that would later become full-on zealotry. The Essenes were separatists. They separated from the situation, from the Roman situation, Roman power. They were the most sectarian of all of these various sects. They were skeptical, not just of Roman power, but also the ruling class in Jerusalem about sort of fraternizing or what kind of collusion might be going on with Rome from those who are ruling in Jerusalem. And so they were distrustful of the priesthood, the temple authorities, these sorts of things. They're often associated with Qumran and the community that may have produced most of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's not a given. There's a lot of debate about this. And if that's the case, then the Qumran sect might be a different sort of sectarian community altogether, perhaps similar or perhaps even identical in some ways to the Essenes. That is up for debate. But we do have a lot of different perspectives about this. Some were obviously going to be much more resistant to Rome than others. Important context here. Now, when we turn to Mark, recall that symbolism of the lion, the four living creatures, the one that had a face like a lion, right? Mark is that particular gospel because of its sort of abrupt, roaring presentation of John the Baptist in the wilderness, declaring that the kingdom of God is at hand, right? What we see in the Gospel of Mark is a rather abrupt presentation of the story of Jesus. We're going to treat the Gospel of Mark separately from the other Gospels and trying to understand it. We want to resist, remember as we talked about, we want to resist that sort of impulse to harmonize, right? We want to understand what Mark's doing on Mark's terms. Now, scholars generally agree that Mark is the earliest Gospel. And when we notice all of the details that Mark is lacking, for example, related to the other ones, we can see that the other Gospels wanted to say more than Mark does. For example, if you think about the fact that Mark begins and ends abruptly, right? Think about the beginning of Mark's gospel. There is no genealogy. There's no introduction to who Jesus is like we see in Matthew and Luke with all this background information. Mark just begins abruptly. We don't even know who this guy is, right? This Jesus figure, if we're reading it for the first time, especially if we were part of that first century audience. We don't even know who this guy is. He's just being baptized. Well, who is he? Why is he significant? And why is he being baptized? What is the point of this, right? It's quite abrupt. Matthew and Luke don't begin that way. They provide a little bit more context, a little bit more background. And of course, John begins as far back as you can go. The most amount of context that you can get, right? In the beginning was the Word, right? But Mark also ends abruptly. We'll say more about this later on in this lecture, but Mark ends abruptly at chapter 16, verse 8, with the women running away afraid after the declaration that Jesus had been risen and that he would meet them in Galilee. They just run away afraid. There actually is no resurrection appearance in the Gospel of Mark. That's a very abrupt ending, especially when we compare it with what we see in Matthew and Luke and John. Very abrupt ending. But it's not just that Mark begins abruptly and ends abruptly. Mark also moves very swiftly. 41 times Mark uses this Greek word euthys, which means immediately. And immediately he did this, and immediately this happened. There's this kind of frenetic energy with which the story is being told. We begin rather abruptly and boom, we hit the ground running, and Mark just carries on with the story. It reminds me a lot of the storytelling that we see in, for example, the Chronicles of Narnia, where we're just thrown into the middle of things. That's that Latin phrase, in media res. We're just thrown into the middle of things. These kids are just tossed into Narnia without the background and the context and knowing what everything is, but they learn about it inductively. And as readers, we experience that too. We learn about Narnia alongside the children as they talk to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, etc., and Mr. Tumnus, right? We learn about Narnia with them inductively as we go through the wardrobe and experience it for the first time. It's quite similar too, if you're familiar with Star Wars, right? We are learning about this galactic situation alongside Luke, right? In the original trilogy, we're learning about everything that's going on with him, thrown into the middle of a story and discerning inductively what really is going on. I think Mark has a very similar storytelling technique, which is quite interesting. How might we learn about this person, Jesus, inductively? And what exactly does Mark want us to learn about Jesus as we proceed? So Mark is quick, it's abrupt, it's also enigmatic. And that enigma is the secrecy of the Gospel of Mark. There's a mystery to the Gospel of Mark. It throws us into the middle of things, and that disorientation seems to be part of the strategy. It is a unique feature to the Gospel of Mark. What, though, is this messianic secret? If we were going to give a definition, this is the peculiar feature of Jesus commanding silence regarding his deeds and identity. Why would Mark tell the story this way? Why would Mark tell the story about Jesus, and after he does something miraculous, after he heals somebody or whatever the case may be, why would he say, don't tell anybody anything that you saw or anything that happened here, right? Why? That's kind of a strange way to tell the story, especially to emphasize it over and over and over again. Why? Well, at least one scholar who really originally kind of noticed this, he explained it in a very particular way. And I want us to think about this particular way of reckoning the Messianic secret, because we're going to take a close look at the theme of the Messianic secret, where we see that sort of theme emerge. And we want to ask, okay, is this explanation actually accurate? Is it helpful? Mark is certainly doing something with the secrecy, but is he doing what the scholar who first noticed it articulated? This is William Vrede. His explanation went like this. He basically said that Jesus didn't actually proclaim that he was the Messiah historically. During his ministry, he never actually claimed to be the Messiah. But after he was resurrected, or at least after the community believed that he was resurrected, they started to explain that Jesus was the Messiah. And so how do you tell the story about him being the Messiah if he never actually taught that he was the Messiah? Well, he must have done it privately. He must have done it secretly. That's kind of the idea. So Mark must be using this motif then as a way of sort of explaining, how come people didn't actually know that he was the Messiah while he was alive? How come people are only talking like this now that he's gone? That's kind of the explanation, okay? I want us to keep that in mind as we move forward. Let me just sort of signpost one obvious problem here. Within the narrative, as we're going to see, it's clear that nobody listens to Jesus. He tells them not to tell anybody else, but the people do anyways. So if that's the explanation as William Vrede provided, that this was a way of explaining how come nobody believed that he was the Messiah while he was alive, well, why tell the story in a way in which nobody's listening to Jesus? They are telling other people, and it is spreading. What is going on there? So here's what I want to do. I want us to work through the Gospel of Mark, look at some of these examples. If you have your Bibles out, please open them up and let's dig in. Beginning with the prologue, chapter 1 of the Gospel of Mark. And that scene that takes place after verse 15 and following. So we get this introduction to Jesus. It's super abrupt, as I've noted. Jesus is baptized, right? And after that prologue, the first 15 verses, the reader is sort of put in this situation. Who is this guy? Why is he important? What is going on? What the reader knows uniquely is that God has spoken, right? This is my beloved son. There's something unique about him, right? But in what way, right? There's so much to learn, and there's so little background at this point, right? The people in the narrative, they're not in the know like the readers are, right? And despite all this, Jesus' reputation grows within the narrative. In chapter 1, later on, just a few verses, Jesus is at a synagogue, and he astounds everybody with his teaching, and the people marvel. And there's a person with an unclean spirit, and he declares, I know who you are, the Holy One of God. And in verse 25, Jesus tells him to be silent. I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Jesus says, stop talking, right? The people were amazed at his authority, and his fame begins to spread, as verse 28 says. And so the reader, right, again, is reading along, or the hearer is listening, and the crowds begin to function kind of like surrogates for the reader. Look at verse 27. What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him, right? Who is this guy, right? The reader is being provoked to ask these same types of questions. Look at verse 34. Jesus casts out demons, and he does not permit them to speak. Mark says, because they knew him. And then later, in chapter 3, verses 11 and 12, it says, whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and shouted, you are the Son of God. But he sternly ordered them not to make him known. What is going on here? Once when Jesus was off praying, this is in chapter 1, verses 37, 38, the disciples found him and they said, everyone is searching for you. But Jesus responds by saying that he must go to neighboring towns instead. Think about that. That seems so counterintuitive. Hey, everybody wants to see you. And Jesus' response is, well, I guess we're going to have to go somewhere else then. That seems kind of peculiar. How that doesn't fit a lot of our sort of preconceived notions about how Jesus operated, right? What is going on? Additionally, another example at the end of chapter 1, there's a person with lepra. And this is typically understood to be leprosy. As you're reading Matt Thiessen's book, Jesus and the Forces of Death, you'll see that he convincingly argues that what we normally think of as leprosy is probably not what this person was experiencing. That actually, when we see terms of leprosy, we should think of lepra, which had more to do with like eczema or dandruff or different types of skin maladies that would have been considered impure for the temple. So this is a slightly different connotation, doesn't really affect too much of what's going on in this scene, but I defer to Matt Thiessen's discussion there and hope you will appreciate what he has to say. Now in chapter 1, this person with lepra, he comes to Jesus asking to be made clean, and Jesus heals him. But then notice what happens in verses 43 to 44. Jesus sternly warns him, right? See that you say nothing to anyone. And of course, the person with lepra doesn't exactly do what Jesus requested. Verse 45 says that the person then proclaimed what had happened freely. But then notice the result, right? What was the result of this person telling everybody what happened? So that Jesus could no longer go into a town openly, but stayed out in the country. This is very intriguing, right? Mark is telling us that people were coming for him, right? But Jesus would not go into towns openly. He would instead stay out in the country as a result of this growing reputation. And there's a theme embedded in this that Mark uses, this feature of how he explains Jesus's use of parables. This is a kind of unique feature in Mark. This scene appears in Matthew, but Mark has a kind of distinct kind of nuance to this. After Jesus teaches the parable of the sower at the beginning of Mark chapter 4, the disciples ask Jesus privately about the meaning of parables, like more broadly. And Jesus gives a very interesting response in verses 11 and 12, right? We may assume that Jesus spoke in parables to make complex things simple, right? That he used everyday examples to make things plain, right? Use mundane examples to communicate clearly, right? But the opposite of that is actually the case as we look at what Mark says here, right? Jesus says, you have been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything comes in parables. In order that, right, this is purpose, in order that they may indeed look but not perceive, and may indeed listen but not understand, so that they may not turn again and be forgiven. Think about that. Parables are for outsiders. Parables are actually to conceal, not to reveal. And this is Mark's explanation of parables. What in the world, right? This citation from Isaiah 6 here is quite interesting. Parables are not about clarity. They are about condemnation. Parables are about judgment. If we then carry on a few verses in Mark 4, look at verses 33 to 34. It says, with many such parables, he spoke the word to them. And as they were able to hear it, he did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples. So this is important. For Mark's secrecy motif, parables themselves are part of advancing this theme of secrecy in the Gospel of Mark. So Jesus comes across as a very confusing individual, very hard to understand and enigmatic. So let's make some preliminary observations about what seems to be going on just with these first couple of chapters in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus wants to control the narrative. Now, this may seem to provide some context for the Messianic secret, right? That he wants to be understood properly. But why? Why exactly? So let's keep moving forward with this thread. After Jesus calms the sea in Mark 4, the disciples act as surrogates again for the reader. Who is this? Right? That even the wind and the sea obey him, right? Again, provoking the reader further. Think about the Gerasene demoniac in chapter 5, right? He bows down and shouts, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." And oddly, right, he knows who Jesus is, right? And oddly, at the end of this interaction, right, this is when the demons go off into the pigs, Jesus does allow the former possessed man to tell his friends what happened to him in verse 19. This is a kind of exceptional moment. This guy is allowed to share his story. That at least messes with this secrecy motif, but nevertheless, it still continues it. Jesus controls the narrative. Jesus is the one who decides when somebody can speak about what they have experienced, right? Again, in chapter 5, after Jesus heals Jairus' daughter, Jesus strictly orders them, no one should know about this. This is chapter 5, verse 43. And earlier, he told the crowds, before he goes in and heals Jairus' daughter, he tells the crowds to leave before he heals her in verse 40. The crowds then, ask the sort of questions that the readers should be asking in chapter 6, verse 2. Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? Right? There's this growing sense of trying to figure out who this guy is. And it's here in chapter 6 that we begin to get more of a sense for why there's been so much secrecy. In chapter 6, verse 14, we get reference to how far Jesus' reputation had reached. King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. There's some suggestion as to who Jesus might really be. Is he Elijah? Is he some other prophet? Is he John the Baptist come back from the dead? This is our first introduction to Herod in Mark's gospel. And spoiler alert, this is how Mark tells us that John the Baptist died, right? It's before the event is ever narrated to us. But why do we get John the Baptist's beheading told to us in this way at this time with the introduction of the character of Herod? Well, in light of the Messianic secret, one gets the immediate sense of how precarious it is for word to spread about Jesus's identity, right? Considering what this Herod guy already did to John the Baptist, it's a dangerous thing for Jesus's fame to spread. And carrying on with this theme, in chapter 7, this is when Jesus is with the Syrophoenician woman. He enters a house and doesn't want anyone to know, yet he could not escape notice, the text says. Again, beyond, even though he's trying to control the narrative, people are still noticing, people are still telling, right? When the Syrophoenician comes, they have this, fascinating conversation, and her daughter is healed and released from demon possession, right? And the Syrophoenician woman kind of understands a little bit about who he is based upon their exchange of a riddle about dogs eating crumbs off of the table. A couple verses later, right? Jesus is healing a man who is deaf and who has a speech impediment. And Jesus orders them to tell no one again, but notice the next line. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it, right? Jesus is reluctant, right, to have all this information be public, and yet it is growing anyways. The fame is growing anyways. In chapter 8, then, we get this really fascinating two-staged healing of a man who was born blind in chapter 8, which we'll come back to. But with this double healing, Jesus tells him, don't even go into the village in chapter 20, in verse 28. Jesus simply sends him home. We'll say more about that double healing, though. After the transfiguration in chapter 9, Jesus orders for the inner three, Peter, James, and John, not to tell anyone what they have seen until after the Son of Man is raised. So at this point in the Gospel of Mark, we really actually come to a hinge point in the way that Mark presents his story of Jesus. And specifically, it's with that healing of the man who is blind in these two stages. Like I said, I'll say more about this. But before I do, I want to just briefly talk about a unique literary feature that we see in the Gospel of Mark, which is kind of informally known as Markan sandwiching, right? Think about a sandwich for a second, a rather modest sandwich. Let's go with grilled cheese for a second. Think about how you have bread on either side and you have, cheese filling in the middle, right? This sandwiching idea is that you start a story, and then before you end the story, you tell a smaller story in between it. That's the idea of this kind of sandwiching literary technique. And Mark does this a lot. So without going into a lot of details, if you think about Mark chapter 5, we just mentioned how Jesus healed Jairus' daughter. Well, the story of healing Jairus' daughter starts with hearing about Jairus' daughter and heading towards healing her. And before he does heal her, the whole story of the woman with the issue of blood is told in between, right? So this is this sandwiching technique. And there's so much that Mark is doing by telling these stories together in that way, where we see how they're mutually interpretive. Jairus' daughter was 12 years old. This woman had this issue for 12 years. There's purity concerns, right? Because this woman is hemorrhaging. And now we have this corpse in this house, right? There's all kinds of commonalities for why Mark would pair these stories together. And we could say more about that. but you can see the literary technique on display. Another interesting example is the story of the feeding of the 5,000. So Jesus does the feeding of the 5,000. Then he has that whole scene where he walks on water and they think they saw a ghost, right? And then if you look at the end of chapter 6, verses 51 to 52, it says, then they got into the boat, then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened, right? So this connects us back to the feeding of the 5,000, but they're getting into the boat after the walking on water. So we see how the feeding of the 5,000 is supposed to be still on our minds when we think about this scene of Jesus walking on water. What does it have to do with the loaves, right? And what's really interesting is there's a scholar named Jason Robert Combs who has argued that this scene needs to be interpreted in the light of ancient ghost stories, specifically the fact that it was thought as part of like the mythology of ghosts that ghosts couldn't hover over water, right? So the fact that they think they saw a ghost is like really absurd because, as we all know, ghosts don't float over water, so to speak, right? Just like, for example, if I were to say, oh no, all the garlic in my fridge is missing. A vampire must have taken it, right? If you know anything about vampire mythology, that is not a very good suggestion. Vampires don't like garlic, right? We all know vampires don't like garlic, right? It's the same kind of idea. And so there's something about them thinking that they saw a ghost that really illustrates that they're not getting it, that they're not understanding. And that even goes back to the loaves, that they didn't understand where that all came from. And Mark is tying this kind of misunderstanding, this kind of lack of discernment into that scene. And he wants us to interpret them together. There are other examples, just quickly. We think about when Jesus is entering Jerusalem and going to cleanse the temple. Right before he cleanses the temple, he curses a fig tree. Then the temple cleansing happens. And then we get this scene in which Jesus sees the withered fig tree and he comments on it. These scenes are meant to be interpreted together. So I bring up this technique because I want us to think about what is going on in Mark chapter 8. Right? The healing of the man who is blind in these two stages. This is a really peculiar thing because when Jesus initially heals the man says that he sees, but he sees things that appear to be trees. He sees people like trees that are walking around. And then Jesus touches him again and he's able to see fully and clearly. What is going on there? Well, again, I think this needs to be tied together with the scenes that surround it. And specifically, if we look at this healing scene, it's surrounded by, on the top end, some discussion about the leaven of the Pharisees, right? This is right after the feeding of the 4,000. Jesus says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And the disciples say, oh, it's because we ran out of bread, right? And Jesus says, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand, right? Because they didn't understand earlier about the feeding of the 5,000. Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? And then he asked them, how many baskets were left over, right? After each of these massive feeding events, 12 with the one and 7 with the other. And Jesus simply asks, do you still not understand? Just notice that emphasis on understanding in this scene, right? And then we get the healing of this man who's blind in two stages where he sees and doesn't fully see, right? Why doesn't Jesus heal the person all at once, right? He sees, but it's blurry, right? He sees people, but they look like trees. What is going on? Well, again, that setup, all about understanding. Don't you get it? Don't you understand? Right? After the healing scene, then, Jesus begins to reveal for the first time who he is. He's been doing a bunch of stuff in the Gospel of Mark, but he hasn't really said a whole lot about who he is or what he's up to. So he asked them, who do you all think that I am? Who do people say that I am? And they say Elijah, John the Baptist, or one of the prophets, right? We saw that list before. We saw that list with the story of Herod, right? But then Jesus asks, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Messiah. That is the first time we've heard that. That is the first time we have seen that overtly, explicitly in the Gospel of Mark. Peter says, you are the Messiah. And what is the immediate reaction of Jesus in verse 30? He says, Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him, right? Notice what happens next, though. Jesus carries on. He begins to teach about who he is for the very first time. But how does he do so? Well, he refers to the Son of Man in this process, a more ambiguous title, or at least one that wouldn't have been fraught with the same sort of associations as a title like Messiah, right? He says that the Son of Man must suffer, right? That he must be rejected and that he must be killed, but that he will rise again. And none of this, of course, matched any expectations about what a Messiah would do, right? The Messiah is supposed to come in and take care of Rome, right? To defeat the enemies and the oppressors, right? And of course, Peter rejects this. Peter rejects this when he hears it. He says you are the Messiah, but once Jesus begins to say what that means, Peter rejects it. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. And then he goes on to talk further about how being his disciple is bound up with carrying his cross and self-denial. So if we go back to the healing of the man who was blind in 2 stages, right, we can see how it functions as a kind of enacted parable, right? Or a kind of prophetic sign act. The disciples, they see, but they don't fully see. You are the Messiah, but can't embrace the fact that the Messiah must suffer and die. They don't see what the cross has to do with Jesus being the Messiah. They don't get that. They have different expectations, right? And as we've seen, Jesus wants to control the narrative, right? Jesus doesn't want everything about what he has done to spread. And as we can see from this hinge point in the story where Jesus begins to teach about himself for the first time, to really identify what his main purpose is, we can see how nobody would have been prepared to receive that. And we can see more clearly why Jesus would want to control the narrative. And from here, Jesus is going to go on to teach about his death a couple different times. And after he does it 3 times, the disciples still don't get it, right? This didn't meet their expectations. They wanted Jesus to show up and do something dramatic and drastic to start the rebellion that they had actually been hoping for. And we see this in a number of moments following from this. For example, there's this moment when James and John are having that little debate about, when Jesus comes into his kingdom, who's going to be sitting at the right hand and the left hand, right? They're thinking about marching into Jerusalem and having this great victory, right, in which they overthrow Rome. They want a kingdom without a cross, right? And when Jesus does triumphantly enter into Jerusalem, the ironic nature of this triumphal entry, right, it is imbued with what their expectations are, that he is coming, right? Hosanna, blessed is the Son of David, that he is coming as king to destroy the oppressors, right? That is part of everybody's expectation. But then what does Jesus do when he gets there? He cleanses the temple, right? You're not supposed to judge us. You're supposed to judge them, right? What in the world is going on here? And in that context, he's also asked about the imperial tax, right? About paying taxes. And Jesus says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar. What is Caesar's? That is not seditious enough, right? They want rebellion. That is not seditious enough, right? And when Jesus is finally arrested, right, before he is sentenced to death, right, somebody standing near him, right, we're told in another gospel it's Peter, but somebody standing near him pulls out a sword and strikes off the high priest's servant's ear, right? And Jesus responds by saying, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come to capture me with swords and clubs," right? Remember the zealots, that is something that they would want to do, right? Jesus has to specifically ask that question because it directly relates to everybody's expectations. In that moment, with Rome coming to arrest Jesus, their backs are up against the wall. They have to act. Here's where the revolt starts. But of course, that didn't actually follow with their complete expectations, right? And consider as well Peter's betrayal when Jesus is on the cross, right? Peter betrays him by saying, "I don't know the man," right? And if you think about it in light of these expectations, right? He's not who I thought he was, right? That's the kind of connotation that we get here. In fact, the disciples don't get it at all. Specifically, none of the male disciples get it at all, right? Right before Jesus is sentenced to death, there's this unnamed woman who anoints Jesus's feet for his burial in Mark 14, right? We can see how she alone brings together these strands of messianic qualities, anointing with oil, but specifically for death, right? Anointing him for his burial. And in Mark 14, verse 9, Jesus says, "Wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." And I think that is a really important scene because it highlights that she, this unnamed woman, right, that she alone understood this dynamic of what Jesus was all about, right? The disciples, they don't get it. Rome gets it. And this is the irony of the crucifixion scene, right? Because the oppressors who are sentencing Jesus to death are the ones who identify Jesus rightly when he's on the cross, right? Think about that soldier. Truly, this is the Son of God, right? And I think this is the function of the Messianic secret in Mark. The reader has been asking all along, who is this guy, right? And Mark wants the reader to realize that this person cannot be understood outside of the cross. An uncrucified Messiah is in fact no Messiah at all. And after this, the disciples flee, right? They're not there. They're not there for the crucifixion. There are women at the crucifixion, right? After Jesus' crucifixion, the tomb is empty. An angelic figure announces that Jesus is not there and that he'll meet them in Galilee and all of this, right? He tells this to women, not to the male disciples that we had been introduced to throughout the gospel. But what do the women do? The women run away without saying anything, and they run away afraid. And that, verse 8, that is where the best and earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark end. They stop right there, abruptly. That doesn't seem like a typical way to end a story, right? Why are we ending right there? That's so cryptic. What happened? Did they eventually tell? Surely they must have, right? Especially if we think about Matthew and Luke, they do provide lengthier resurrection appearances, right? Well, because Mark ends so abruptly and cryptically, of course, this wasn't a very satisfying ending, and so some later additions were added. There's a shorter ending of a couple of verses that were added, but there's also a longer one. And when you look at the details of them, you can see how secondary they are, how they seem to be a kind of mismatch of different traditions from Luke and Matthew, for example. But they're not original. That's not what Mark originally wrote. And so we have some options here as we think about what might be going on. For example, is it the case that the longer ending is authentic, that the longer ending was actually written by Mark? Well, this is something that King James onlyists proposed, people who affirm the King James, because those verses 9 to 20, are represented there. And so scholars who are King James onlyists, they're going to say that the longer ending is authentic. This is not a common view at all outside of these circles. Okay. Another suggestion, though, is that maybe we lost the ending of Mark for some reason, that maybe the ending was lost, that Mark actually wrote a proper ending, quote unquote proper ending, but that it got lost somehow. Another suggestion, though, is that Mark is an unfinished gospel, that it's this great work of art that just never got completed, that Mark was in the process of finishing the gospel, but just never got around to it. That's another suggestion. But the final suggestion, and the one that I think is the most likely, as well as probably the most common one that you'll find in the scholarship on the Gospel of Mark, is that Mark actually did intend to end the gospel right at verse 8. And what I would say is that this fits everything that we've seen with the Messianic secret. Because where you end a story depends entirely on the story that you're telling, right? This, I think, is quite fitting. Think about this. The women who run away afraid after the resurrection reflect the inversion of the Messianic secret, right? Earlier, people are told not to say anything, but they do. And here, the women are told to go and tell, but they don't. What kind of rhetorical effect might this have on the reader? How might the reader be prompted to then go and tell about the resurrection of Jesus, being inspired by the way that this story ends so abruptly, to carry on what the angel had told these women to do? And I think this ending is so in line with not only the cryptic nature of the Gospel of Mark, but also the emphasis on secrecy, which I think makes the Gospel of Mark so intriguing and so fascinating, and ultimately so compelling that puts the onus on the reader to continue to tell the story about the resurrected Jesus.